Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome all viewers. Alhamdulillah, we have a very special guest today with us in Florida, live in the flesh. Michael Abraham, also known as Abraham Education. He was kind enough to fly into Florida Thursday night, and then Friday he gave a wonderful khutbah, and Friday evening he had a wonderful session about managing kids, and then Saturday we had a great event as well where we focused more on how kids learn. So, assalamu alaikum, akhi, and thank you for joining us.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good to see you, brother. Nice to see you. Nice to have met you in person this weekend.
It's been a pleasure, akhi. So if you don't mind, I'd love to just get to know more about your background and introduce, your history to the viewers. So I know you're born and raised in Minnesota, and what was it like, I guess, growing up?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, bismillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Yeah, so I am from Minnesota. I was born there. I'm the only member of my family who was born there. My parents are originally from New York State. And I lived in New Jersey for a little bit growing up as well. So I'm kind of an East Coast transplanted Minnesotan. But I converted to Islam, about 16 years ago, 17, it was 2007, 17 years ago or so. And my father, he's ethnically Arab. His paternal lineage is Syrian. So his great-grandfather came to the country.
So you said that ethnically, your lineage goes back to Syria, right? So you're Arab. How did your name become, I guess, Abraham? That's your last name?
Yeah, that's my last name. And even though I'm a revert to Islam, that is my birth last name. And sometimes I get asked about, people ask, why did you choose Abraham, not Ibrahim? Sometimes people see my own channel, and it's called Abraham Education, and assume it has something to do with perennialism or like unity of the Abrahamic faiths.
I guess there's two things there. There's the fact that you're an Arab and it says Abraham, and also you're a convert to Islam. So even your Arab lineage is Christian?
That's correct. That's correct. So my great-grandfather, when he came to this country, the family name was actually Hanna, which is a fairly large Arab Christian tribe to my understanding. And Hanna is what Arab Christians call John. So my great-grandfather, when he came to the country, was given the last name Abraham and the first name John. So that's how my last name ended up becoming Abraham.
Do you know the demographics regarding religion in Syria? I guess at least before.
I believe Syria is about 10 to 15% Christian. Okay. And then the rest is mostly Muslim. Mm-hmm. With different regions being more Christian than others. So I do know where my family's from. They're from a very, very small village in the north called Matan Sahel, which means like village on the coast or fort on the coast. And it is predominantly Orthodox Christians there, which is what my father is. But there are some Alawites, there, which is like, the Alawites are it's the religion of Bashar al-Assad. But I'm very disconnected from it. I really only have one family member who's kept in touch with family back in the country there and that type of thing.
Because you said your great-grandfather came over, right?
That's correct.
So your dad was even already kind of removed. Right?
Correct. Yeah, my father is really pretty much disconnected from Arab culture altogether. Okay. He's a pretty traditional American baby boomer. So, I mean, it played into my life just growing up, knowing that I was ethnically Arab, and really actually kind of having a different experience with that growing up in Minnesota versus my father. Because on the East Coast, people who are of Arab descent or Greek descent or this type of thing, they pretty much blend in with other white people. In Minnesota, the most white people are German or they're Norwegian ethnicity. They're mostly blonde-haired, blue-eyed individuals such as yourself. Oh. So just kind of the general perception of what a white person is a little different in Minnesota. And I mean, I consider myself white, and Arabs are actually technically white in Minnesota. And in general, I grew up culturally as a white person. But I wasn't always considered that way by everyone who I met growing up in Minnesota, which was kind of a weird experience for my parents and my father because they never had that growing up. Mm-hmm. So they didn't really know how to deal with that type of thing.
I bet you're half Arab, right? Because you're maternally...
Yeah, my mother's not Arab at all.
Right.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. So that made me curious. I mean, at different points in my life, I was a little curious to know more about what it meant to be Arab and didn't have much access or many sources for that information growing up. But that really changed when 9/11 happened. As a senior in high school when 9/11 happened. And that just made being Arab a lot more prevalent to my life. Jokes from friends and all this type of stuff. That I was a terrorist and this type of thing, which was a joke. Faced some discrimination that I experienced in this type of thing. Mm-hmm. But, just having that part of the world front and center on the U.S. news and all this type of stuff, it made me feel a pressure to know more about it. Like, it was awkward with America being at war with the Arab world, essentially, and being Arab, but not really, people come to you and ask you to explain what's going on to them and this type of thing and the history behind it. Mm-hmm. So it made me want to know more about that. So I ended up studying the politics of the Muslim world in college is basically what ended up happening. Okay. And then while I was doing that, that's how I learned about Islam. I mean, I can talk about what I learned in university regarding Islam.
But before we get, I don't want to get too, before we get into that,
sure.
I mean, were you raised Christian and stuff like that?
Yeah. So my father's Eastern Orthodox or Syrian Orthodox. My mother's Roman Catholic, so I was raised Roman Catholic.
Like really practicing? Or?
Yeah, my mother is a pretty conservative Catholic. She went to Catholic school growing up. Part of my upbringing is that, my mother was a very moral person. She was also she's kind of a strict mother too. Catholics, they're well known for guilt. You weren't raised Catholic, correct?
Protestant,
right. Catholics, especially Catholic mothers, they're well known for being very good at giving guilt trips. And my mother was definitely that way. So she had a moral sense about her, and she'd very much make me feel bad when I did things wrong, which was difficult growing up, but something I'm very thankful now. And that kind of played into my moral development growing up, which I later resonated with when learning about Islam. So I was raised Catholic. For people who don't know, there's kind of a process, even when you're born to a Catholic family, there's kind of a process to becoming Catholic. So you get baptized when you are a baby, that's your first initiation into the Catholic Church. Then you have your first communion when you're like a small child at like 8, and then you get confirmed like about the time you're a teenager. So I was baptized and had my first communion, but I did not get confirmed Catholic because when I was 13 and it came time for me, you have to take a lot of classes in Catholicism before getting confirmed, this type of thing, which my mother was actually teaching at our church. And when it came time to take those classes, I was actually being influenced by my older sister, who also did not get confirmed and was really into Marxism and this type of thing at the time. So she was getting me into the whole like religion's the opium of the masses type of thinking and this type of thing. That was one part of it. The other part of it was I just didn't want to go to classes in the evening when I was already going to school, this type of stuff. I didn't like going to church because I wanted to stay home and watch football. There's also those types of things. Yeah. But when I was 13, I decided not to get confirmed and not go to those classes. And respect to my mother in that even though it was something really important to her and she argued with me a lot about it, and I think it was difficult for her because I went to my first confirmation class and she was the teacher of the classes, and then I didn't go to any after that. But she ultimately had a sense that it had to be my choice and didn't force me to do it in this type of thing, even though she encouraged me to. So I never got confirmed as Catholic.
Okay. And what about your dad being Orthodox? Was there any sort of clashing in the house? Or?
Yeah. So he's not religious. He believes in God, and that, that was a whole thing too. Because I remember growing up really having a feeling that Christianity wasn't really for men, and this is something people talk more about now. Like there's the whole thing with the kind of, how weak Christianity has become and this type of stuff, kind of the Ned Flanders characterization of Christianity, this type of thing. But, when we would go, my father would not go to church with us growing up. So when Sunday would come, my mother would take me, my brother, and my sister to church, and my dad would stay home. And that played into things. And I do remember learning things at church. My mother was actually very good at taking whatever was talked about by the priest and kind of talking to us about us. So a lot of the values of the rules of religion and stuff, my mother did give me a foundation in. But also as a kid, it was like, well, Dad stays home. I want to stay home.
Right. I mean, I
wanted to watch football and this type of thing,
She's definitely, I guess, kind of the odd one out because your dad wasn't going to church, and then after your sister didn't get confirmed, it's like you're just...
My older brother did, but he kind of dropped it as a practice as well. And, the thing is, too, not long after I chose not to get confirmed, really my mother stopped going to church, too. So she's what you'd call a lapsed Catholic now as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Well, it seems like, we're both around the same age. I feel like our generation, everyone sort of left Christianity. I feel like it was so much more of a Christian country, and people have just really moved away from it. But
well, our parents' generation is who really started moving away from it. The baby boomers started all that liberalization, this type of thing. And that's the thing about my mother, because she was like a feminist as well. Even though she had conservative social values, she still considered herself kind of a feminist, this type of thing. But, feminist in a sense that she thought women should work in this type of stuff and women shouldn't be afraid to be leaders and that type of thing. I do know, I can, I know from my upbringing, she was very much against the sexualization of women, though. And she was a type of feminist who considered it that way and that type of thing. And that was a value I had growing up as well. That again, getting to things. Because when I discovered Islam, like I had formed into a person who had grown to have an appreciation for almost every aspect of it before actually accepting it. So then when I learned about it, learned everything that it was, I didn't have any doubt in accepting it. And yeah, kind of the more conservative sexual mores, if you will. I mean, that was something that my mother inculcated on us. And then of course, growing up seeing peers struggle with all that type of stuff.
Well, I was going to ask, how did people know that you were Arab? Because you're already sort of, you're mixed with European, and also it's like you have a Muslim Arab name, and it seems like...
Well, I mean, that's the whole thing. Not everyone would growing up.
Yeah.
But I would get people who'd ask...
People would think you're like Latino, maybe. Or,
I got asked if I was Indian quite a bit.
Oh, okay.
Growing up, I got asked if I was Indian. I got asked, "What are you?"
Right.
Just those types of general questions. And of course, I was mistaken for being Jewish quite a bit, especially because of my last name, this type of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So just navigating those types of confusions. And it's funny too because I can remember telling people that I was Syrian growing up, and frequently people would say, "What's that?" or "Where is that?" or this type of thing. Then after 9/11, people have a little bit more of an idea. And then, of course, when all the ISIS stuff went down, then I was getting asked all the time, well, what, this was after I had become Muslim,
right.
Tell people you're Syrian. Well, what do you think about what's going on there? Those types of questions.
Well, let's get right into your embracing Islam. So 9/11 happens, I guess, is that when sort of you really started looking into these things?
Sort of. I mean, as a senior in high school, that was when things started... I mean, just the whole world changed. That was when, I started having...
It was unavoidable. Islam was unavoidable at that point. Right. I'm saying for everyone.
Correct. I mean, that was when I first started having some social interactions that made me feel the pressure, I need to know about this. I mean, now, for one thing, I was kind of into politics already. Like I told you, I had an older sister who was teaching me about Marxism and things when I was in middle school and this type of stuff. My parents were fairly political. They were kind of typical baby boomer, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Democrats, this type of thing. I was into electoral politics and all type of that. So that was the whole thing, too. People I knew me as someone who was, a little bit known. I knew about politics a little bit and that type of stuff. So, then, the Arab world becomes front and center in America's political world. And I'm an Arab kid, and people know me as someone who knows about politics already. People would ask me about it, but I didn't really know the particulars of politics in the Middle East or this type of thing. So, I mean, when I went to college, I took a year off after high school. When I first went back to school, I first was studying recording arts for a little bit because I was into music. We were all into music back in those days and that type of thing, But I left that pretty quickly and switched to political science. And when I switched to political science, I started studying constitutional law and then the politics of the Muslim world, basically. Okay. So, I mean, again, two things happened at this juncture because, number one, I was in university taking some classes, and I was going to the University of Minnesota. And I had, when I first went to college, I moved to downtown Minneapolis. So, being in Minneapolis, and I went to community college before going to the University of Minnesota, that kind of put me around the Somali community in Minnesota because they lived down there at the community college. A lot of my classmates were East African immigrants.
Well, real quick, can we get into that history just real briefly, how the Somali community thrived so much in that particular area, I mean, how many generations are,
Hold on a sec.
I mean, just briefly, because...
I don't like the brief version. No, I just say it because in my book and in the trainings I do for educators, I talk about this. Yeah. And it's important for people to know. So there was a civil conflict in East Africa in the early 90s. And, something a way in which they are stereotyped, certainly by white Minnesotans and people in our region is oh, well, they just had this infighting or whatever, this type of thing, and they came here. But the conflicts in Somalia are seated in World War II. So after World War II, if you look on the map and you see the border of Somalia and Ethiopia, the eastern region of Ethiopia is like a plain region, whereas the western region is very hilly. That whole eastern region of Ethiopia is traditionally inhabited by Somali people. But after World War II, when Britain and America were drawing the borders of the New World, essentially, this is not dissimilar to what happened in other parts of the Muslim world. They gave that whole section of land to the Ethiopian government because Britain was on better terms with the government of Ethiopia than they were of Somalia, because Somalia had been colonized more recently at that point by Italy, who was against the British in World War II. So they wanted Ethiopia to have that land. So, like, secession movements started thereafter in that part of Ethiopia in the 1970s. And when the Ethiopian government was kind of having some internal conflicts, there was actually a movement of Somalis in eastern Ethiopia, or western Somalia as it's called, or some people call it the Ogaden region. There's this thing people debate over what it's supposed to be called and this type of stuff. But conflicts started in that region first between Somalis wanting to secede from the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian government. People can look up the Ogaden Wars. And after about 3 years of that, the government of Somalia, led by the leader at the time, Siad Barre, he sent the military of Somalia into Ethiopia to support the secession movement. And now when that happened, Siad Barre was heavily backed by the Soviet Union, but he also had good relationships with the United States. But both of them completely flipped on him when he did that. So the Soviet Union sent a bunch of troops from Cuba to fight against the Somalis, and they ravaged it very badly. It was all in the late 70s. That's what initially started like the refugee crisis and the conflicts in Somalia. And that resulted in internal fighting after they faced that defeat within the Somali military and government. So then you had the conflicts in the early 90s that broke out, and more with the refugee crisis in general. So I just like to give that background for people in Somalia. If there's any Somalis who are watching who want to add more, they will comment, and they're free to comment in this type of thing. But I just like to give that background so people know there's a little bit of a deep history to all that. Somalis first came to San Diego when they came to America. But there was not many jobs in San Diego. So when they first came to Minnesota, they actually came to two small towns in western Minnesota. One called Wilmer and one called Marshall, Minnesota, which are both towns of about 30,000 people or so, a little bit more, which nowadays have almost like 25% of their population. Actually, I should say 25% of their school districts is Somali kids now. Why? Because they have poultry factories. So at that time in the 90s, late 90s more, those poultry factories were like the economic engines of these small towns, and they were telling the small towns, if you don't get people to work for us, we're going to leave. So they actually recruited refugees to come work there. And the same thing happened in other cities, in Kansas and Tennessee. You can find these small towns with poultry factories have almost the same exact demographics between white people and Somalis now. After they went there, then they went to the Twin Cities, and the same thing, and it just bloomed. And, you know, the Minnesota in general had, and especially Minneapolis, it had policies that were very, very welcoming to refugees, essentially. A lot of church organizations there were partnered with the State Department stuff to work on refugee resettlement and this type of thing. And Minnesota needed it for its economy because they would have suffered a population loss had they not come. So they have a very essential role in that, not least of which in the school districts. And might talk about my work in education here in a little bit, but several school districts in the state of Minnesota, if you break down the demographics of them, over the past 20 years, the total amount of students hasn't changed much, but the demographics of the students has changed drastically to where a lot of these districts, 20 years ago, they're like 94, 95% white students. Now some of them, they're down as low as 50 to 60% white students. And in many of them, the better portion of that change has been Somali students. So if those kids hadn't come and those families hadn't come, all those school districts would have had massive cuts in staffing. They might have had to close schools and all that type of stuff. This is kind of a talk I give to educators back home so they understand, because like the job market is actually dependent on them being there and this type of thing.
Interesting. Yeah, so I guess we sort of got there because those are the people that first gave you dawah when you were like in college?
Well, you know, no one gave me dawah directly, but their character gave me dawah. Okay, like those students who I went to community college with, a very clear dynamic in the classes. And these are adult immigrants, not like people who've grown up in the country. They took the classes so much more seriously than people like myself and other kids like myself who'd grown up in Minnesota or in the suburbs of this type of thing. And you know how like college was portrayed to us growing up in this type of thing by the baby boomers. Like it's supposed to be a party time and all this type of stuff.
Yeah, best time of your life.
Yeah, man, it's all very shameful when you look back on it. You know, I remember taking a course on U.S. civics. And the East Africans being able to answer questions about the U.S. government, you know, better than kids who went to high school in the country and this type of thing. You know what I mean? So like I felt embarrassed actually, like in those classes amongst the white kids of how unprepared we were for the classes, you know, and just our laziness. Whereas these immigrants are there taking it very seriously, clearly working very hard for it. You know, another thing that really impressed me about, I'm just down the street from where I was living in the Loring Park neighborhood in Minneapolis. There was a street corner on Nicollet and 15th Avenue where there was a coffee shop, a restaurant, and a convenience store, all run by Somalis. And just that, you'd see them coming in and out, you know, and just they very clearly had community. And that was something like a lot of Americans like us grew up with not having. You know, you don't really have a community who you're tied to in this type of thing. You know, I realized my father kind of did, and certainly my grandfather, when they were closer to the immigrant generation. But, you know, it's just something that impressed me and that type of thing. And, you know, at the same time, like when I started studying politics and I had like this attention on the war on terror, which was all going on this time. This was, you know, 2003 to 2007, before the time where I was living there, before I became Muslim. You know, and I would watch Fox News, this type of thing. I would watch C-SPAN all the time. I listened to what both the right and left would say. And, of course, all this right-wing propaganda against Islam, this type of thing. And it made it very clear to me, like, clearly they're lying about the things they say about Islam and Muslims, and there's something whole else to it, because I could see that the character of the Muslims around me was very different.
That's the crazy thing about the anti-Muslim propaganda. It's like, if you don't know, you don't know, and you can believe it. Yeah. But when you know Muslims and you know Islam, it's so blatantly dishonest. You know what I'm saying? It's like unbelievable.
I know. I mean, that's the mainstream media in general. You know, it's funny because, you know, studying Islam and now education's the other thing that I've gotten some expertise in. And when it's not exactly the same, but whenever I see education talked about in the news and stuff, it's always correct. These people don't know what they're talking about.
Right. A lot of the time when you're an expert in something, you can...
Exactly. So, like, you know, anyone who knows about Islam, they see that when it's talked about in the mainstream media. But that's what's actually going on with everything.
That's true. Yeah, you're right. SubhanAllah.
Yeah.
I guess let's just get into like you taking your shahada.
Yeah, so, you know, in 2007, the 2006-2007 school year, I transferred to the University of Minnesota at that point. I took a course called Islamist Politics, in which they teach you everything you can imagine just by that name. I mean, you're literally, you know, and we studied like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir. You know,
I mean, that seems like a rare type of course. Is that common in colleges?
You know, it's somewhat rare. The University of Minnesota is a horrible place to study, to learn about Islam and learn about Muslims and this type of thing.
But I'm surprised that there's such a specific type of course on Islam there.
Yeah. It wasn't available everywhere. And I do remember the professor, you know, her name was like Catherine Hounds or something like this. I've tried to look her up since, because I don't think I can remember her name exactly. And, you know, something that I didn't learn about Islam properly per se from this course or any of the other courses I would take at the University of Minnesota, but it like revealed to me the need to go do my own learning and find out from an authentic source about it, this type of thing. You know, I remember now in that class we did like watch. I remember watching an introductory video where they explained some basics about Islam, and they explained the whole story of Abraham and Ishmael and this type of thing. And I did not know until that time that Islam believed in Abraham and that it was an Abrahamic religion, per se, and this type of thing. And I almost felt like, because of my name, I almost felt cheated at that point, you know, because I grew up obviously knowing about Christianity, and I got mistaken for being Jewish a lot growing up, so I knew very well that was an Abrahamic religion. It really blew my mind that there was a whole other religion out there that was an Abrahamic religion. I didn't know that. We also learned at that time they believe in Jesus. And I do remember learning in that one class that they actually think the Quran is the literal spoken word of God. And I thought all that was amazing. And I remember after learning that thinking, well, I imagine we're going to read the Quran in this class, because if all these people believe in this religion and we're studying that part of the world and they think this book is that important, then we definitely need to know what it says. Now, we didn't learn that, but, they gave us a book called, a book that actually people should know a little bit about, because it was published by the Brookings Institute. And the Brookings Institute is a very influential think tank in America. They brand themselves as being like kind of moderate, like centrist, this type of thing. But they can really affect foreign policy. Everyone talks about the Rand Institute, but the Brookings Institute is very influential as well. And they published a book called Islam, a Mosaic, Not a Monolith. And you'll hear people say this phrase that Islam's not a monolith and this type of thing. That all comes from the Brookings Institute. And from this book, because that book was being, it was circulating around academia at that time. And it was written, after 9/11 and in the context of the war on terror. And it was intended to put a more moderate view on Islam. But really, it reinforced something that is just always done in academics, where they really emphasize the diversity of Islam. Not to say that there isn't diversity amongst Muslims, of course, and this type of thing. But you would read that book and think like Sufism and Shiism and Sunni Islam are all just kind of equal. Like in the amount of people and in the extent to which it's practiced, and all type of stuff. That is something that is done extremely regularly in Western academia. That they actually, Edward Said even writes about this in his book Orientalism a little bit. How the overemphasis on niche practices that are called Islamic or this type of thing, especially Sufism and this type of thing. So, I read that book, got some ideas about it, and then we had this like thick reader, because back in the day in colleges, you would buy like 1 or 2 books for the classes, and then the professor would often like get a copied reader of a bunch of different chapters or a bunch of different writings, and you'd get like a packet that was a whole bunch of different writings in it. And there's a whole bunch of different things in there. You have all this junk on political theory and stuff you got to read in political science. But, we had to read the founding documents of Hizb ut-Tahrir and of Hamas. Wow. And we read, there's a lot of writings of Sayyid Qutb in there as well, because Sayyid Qutb in Western academia, he's the godfather of extremism and all this type of stuff. So we read Social Justice, not the whole thing, but there was a chapter on social justice in Islam, one of Sayyid Qutb's books, and parts of Milestones as well. And writings from Ayatollah Khomeini and this type of thing too. So, I remember getting confused by a lot of that stuff overall, like overall getting confused.
Yeah, that's kind of like the opposite of what I experienced, and probably many people. It's like I read the Quran and I learned like Islam being one thing. You were exposed immediately to all the different sects and stuff.
I know. And that's why I kind of resent people who, like, because the divisions within Islam is like, that's what they put front and center to you when you study in academia. Especially if you're studying the politics of it and this type of stuff. So I'm always a little resentful to people who think like converts are naive or this type of thing when they get in. Like I knew that, and I knew that Islam was very divided and Muslims are very divided and all that type of stuff well before getting into it. Although despite that, I still think relative to the other religions, they are much more united. But Qutb's writings. And, I've obviously learned quite a bit about Sayyid Qutb since then. And I even have some of my own things that I wrote about him that I have on my website when I was at the outset of doing my work in education, this type of stuff. But, in Social Justice in Islam, that chapter did make me really curious about Islam as like a potential option for being a system of governments and like a system of of organizing a society, this type of thing, which I was studying in other areas because I was into that aspect of politics already. And I was studying constitutional law in other classes and this type of thing. And the debate between Republicans and Democrats had always very interested me. And at that time, where I was ideologically, I was raised in a family that was liberal, very Democrat, vote for the Democratic Party type of thing. But from studying politics, I had opened my mind more to arguments of the Republican Party and of conservatives in America in general. That was something I was shielded from growing up. Like when you grow up in a liberal family, a lot of times, you're told like the liberal positions and their intellectual justifications behind them, and then conservatives just kind of think what they think because they're racist or this type of stuff. Through studying, I learned that there's actually a lot of intellectual justification between more conservative positions. And then in my personal life, especially the social values and this type of stuff, I was becoming intellectually convinced in some of those things. So anyway, in Social Justice in Islam, Sayyid Qutb has a line where and scholars have written how this is one of his heretical lines, but he says that Islam is molded from Christianity and communism. And he was trying to make this argument of like it has some of, to say it's molded from that, it's a heretical statement and something he shouldn't have said, amongst many things he said that he shouldn't have said. But what he was getting at was it's like a balanced approach between the extremes of the West, where you have conservative Christians on one side, and then you have like the economic justice people, and now the term social justice warriors, this type of thing has developed since that type of thing. And that resonated with me where I was in my own intellectual development at the time. So reading that made me very, very curious to learn more. And, I would ask teachers at the University of Minnesota kind of more questions. And this woman who was the professor of that class in particular, this Islamist politics class, I remember her showing off to us that she gave consultation to the Department of Defense, and that she was actually giving presentations on Islam and the Muslim world to the Department of Defense on 9/11, when the planes hit the Pentagon, this type of thing. And, but then I would read these things and ask her questions, and she couldn't answer basic questions and this type of thing. Mm-hmm. Like, I remember them giving us an assignment where we had to identify whether or not Sayyid Qutb was Sunni or Shia. And when I was doing that assignment, I thought he was Shia because of the things that he says about some of the companions in the writings that they gave us. And then in that book that they gave us from the Brookings Institute, they explained in that book, like, well, a thing about the Shia is they don't like some of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, whereas Sunnis, they revere the companions and they don't insult them, this type of thing. And I remember her saying, no, Sayyid Qutb was Sunni. And I asked her, well, if he's Sunni, why was he saying bad things about the companions of the Prophet Muhammad when we read in the other thing that Sunnis aren't supposed to say that? And I remember saying, I don't know, I never really thought about that, So I'm like, okay, you're advising, you're a professor in a university, you're like advising the Department of Defense, and you don't even know this much about it, So anyway, if you want me to keep going, like one day, actually it was when that school year ended. Because, when you're in the semesters, you're so busy reading stuff that the school assigns you. It was like, I lived in Minneapolis. The University of Minnesota campus is on the other side of the river from the downtown area. And I live near downtown. I live on campus. And in between it is this neighborhood called the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, which is where the most Somalis are. It's kind of the neighborhood they were first put into in this type of thing. And it's actually kind of the center of much of the Somali diaspora, actually. But anyway, I would walk from downtown to the campus when I go to school. I didn't take the bus because I get motion sickness and this type of thing. And actually, when I finished finished taking my final exams, and I finally had the chance to go get something to read, wouldn't have to read for school, I stopped in a bookstore in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood that they had, a Somali bookstore, and I went and told the guy, I need an English translation of the Quran. And I remember him, he had to go in the back, and he got out a box, and, because they're mostly selling to people local there, so most of those books were like in Somali or Arabic, this type of thing, He had to go in the back and get out a box and open it, and it was one of those smaller copies of the Abdullah Yusuf Ali translation, The Meaning of the Holy Quran. And I went home and read that, and really I did not read very far into it until I decided that I was going to become a Muslim. And the things I knew about the religion already, like I said, the values, and alcohol is a big thing too. I despised alcohol, and I was 22 at this time. And how it is in American culture when you're getting into that age, like all your old friends want to do is go to bars and this type of thing. And I had zero interest in that. So I was looking for a life, outside of that and outside this partying type of thing. So there's all these different aspects of it that I respected. And just upon reading it, a thing too, I remember it not being totally clear to me whether or not, what it took to become a Muslim. That's actually something a lot of non-Muslims have some confusion about. It's changing as time goes. Non-Muslims don't know a lot about Islam. But, from like a Catholic upbringing, if you want to convert to Catholicism, you got to take classes for it. And then to officially become Catholic, there's got to be a ceremony you go through and this type of thing. But I remember reading Surah Al-Baqarah and talking about those who accept the message versus those who don't. It just became clear to me, anyone can accept this religion. And so just reading the Quran, from there.
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah. And I spent that summer knowing I wanted to become Muslim, but not knowing exactly how. And again, no individual had given me dawah. You know, the Somali community had through watching them from the periphery. And then I was doing learning through books. So I had decided at the beginning of that summer I wanted to become Muslim, but didn't know how. And I would wait tables for work. So I got this new job that summer at this breakfast restaurant in Franklin and Chicago and Minneapolis, run by a Columbia woman called Maria's Cafe. And in the office right behind it, there was an Ethiopian brother who ran a chiropractic office. His name was Rashid. And he would come in there for coffee. And one day I was talking to him, and I said to him, I want to become Muslim. And he was like about to drink. I remember very clearly he looked up at me like this, like when I said that to him, and like he had to go after that, and he's like, wait, I'm going to come back to you, like but like I remember thinking like, man, he's like really like worked up about that. And I eventually arranged with him to go to a masjid in northeast Minneapolis on Central Avenue called Masjid Al-Huda, which those in Minnesota would know about it, because it's across the street from Holy Land Restaurant. And yeah, it was actually the first night. It was the night Ramadan came in 2007. It was the first night Ramadan came in. And I took my shahada from Sheikh Jamal Ben Amour, he's still a sheikh in Minnesota. He's from Tunisia originally. And before we did it, he told me the hadith of how on the first night of Ramadan, the shayateen are locked up and this type of thing. And there were several people there, some of whom I'm still friends with today. So that was when I first took shahada. And then that brother who was the chiropractor, he took me to Tarawih at that masjid every night. He came and picked me up and took me to Tarawih, and I began learning about Muslims from that point on.
MashaAllah. I'm sure from there, now you're in with the Muslim community, you know where the masjid is, you have some friends, and then it's just about practicing and going forward from there, right?
And that was really important, actually, because the summer I spent after I bought the Quran and knowing I wanted to become Muslim before actually being immersed in the Muslims, it was Allah's decree, but that can be somewhat of a delicate position for someone, because especially when you're that age, because I had like a lot of fury for it, like when I first discovered it, and that summer was rough with my family, because like I had told my family like I wanted to be, or like I'm Muslim now, or this type of thing. I hadn't taken the shahada yet, and I was reading the Quran, this type of stuff, and sometimes people always ask like, oh, how'd your family react and this type of stuff when you became Muslim, which is something like I come from a loving and very supportive family, and this type of thing. And I did have problems with them, but it was rooted in my own pushing too hard and this type of stuff at that time, So the community right away, like when I told that going on, they taught me about the importance of your parents and being good to your parents, all that type of stuff, and they did a lot to help rectify all that and that type of thing.
Yeah, mashallah. Yeah. I can relate so much to everything that you said, but a very similar story as well. But all right, so I guess what was the next step in your journey, in terms of Islam and practicing Islam, learning more about it, and eventually going overseas, correct?
Yeah, so alhamdulillah, after taking Shahada, the Islamic University of Minnesota, which was together at that time, still is, they offer a free year of classes to anyone who accepts Islam. And at that time, that masjid and that sheikh, they were all a part of that. So it wasn't long for me at all. I mean, I think it was even that day that they told me about that, and I got signed up for classes. And I took this was fall of 2007, I took that year off of school, actually. And I would go to school on and off anyway, because that was the pattern I went into, so I could afford school. But I spent that year, 2007, 2008, taking classes with the Islamic University of Minnesota. That got me some grounding in, Aqidah and this type of stuff, and reading books, spent a long time learning what I could at that time. After that, I went back to school to get my degree finished the next year, and there was a masjid very close to the University of Minnesota called Dar al-Farouk. It's moved to a different location now and is a lot bigger, where Sheikh Walid al-Manisi was the imam. And they also owned a house next to the masjid, and they would rent that out to people. So I actually moved into that house for the 2008-2009 school year. And I lived there and worked in the sheikh's office and would go to the classes, help out with the weekend school, all that type of thing. That got me really in tune to things going on with the Muslim youth, the Muslim. I've been more around Muslim adults, like in college classes, type of thing. But that started to get me connected to the kids. Really got a feel for everyone's anxiety over the youth at that time and all that. And that led to another brother who was really involved in the masjid. He left at that time to go into Saudi to start working at elementary school teaching English. And I ended up following him there a year later. And that's how I actually got started in education. I didn't have a degree in education at that time. I just had my political science degree from the University of Minnesota. But in 2010, I moved to Jeddah and started working at Al-Andalus Private School. People who know Jeddah, they probably know Saudi German Hospital. It's right across the street from there. And at that time, King Abdullah, he had made a decree to change the education laws in Saudi so that Saudi citizens could start taking foreign education programs. So before that, international schools and this type of thing in Saudi, only expatriates could enroll their kids into them. But after he made a decree in like 07 or 08 or sometime, you had all these Saudi private schools that served mostly the kids of Saudi citizens wanting to do American education. So Al-Andalus, they wanted to do an American curriculum, and they put a lot of work into the people that they hired at the schools, and they were trying to get as many American teachers as possible. So alhamdulillah, I moved to Saudi in 2010, and that's also where I started as a teacher.
MashaAllah, what was your experience like? I mean, embracing Islam and then moving to Saudi. I mean, being in a Muslim country, being around other Muslims.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, it's funny how time moves differently through your life, because it's strange for me to think that when I went to Saudi, I'd only been Muslim 3 years, because it felt a lot longer at that time. Like those 3 years felt long. And I remember when I got the job in Saudi being excited about it. And I can remember thinking, yeah, it's finally time for me to go to the Muslim world and this type of thing. When really I'd only been Muslim for 3 years. Alhamdulillah, I liked Saudi quite a bit. I mean, there's it's easy to pray. The driving isn't great. In Jeddah you can make Umrah all the time. It's very nice to be a Western expatriate there. You get treated. Saudis, people who've been there know they're very eager to treat Americans very well. Even I got to make Hajj the fall that I went there, and the Jeddah Dawah Association, where Abu Musab was at the time, Wejdi, for those of you who know, One Way to Paradise. They were giving away Hajj to expatriates. Like you could apply and have a Hajj paid for free, through donations from people and this type of thing. So, I've only been there 2 months and I got to go on Hajj. Alhamdulillah. I love Saudi, actually. While I was there, the big thing was, I was working all the time. I brought my family there. And, I worked day and night. I worked at an elementary school during the day, and then like the tutoring centers in the evening. Eventually started running a tutoring center basically out of my apartment because there's such a high demand for English language tutoring in Saudi at that time. Just from people I knew from going to the masjid to pray in the neighborhood wanted me to tutor their kids. So I was working day and night, alhamdulillah. I didn't go there to study like other people. And I'm kind of rare too, because a lot of brothers who go to the Khalij to work, not too many of them come back. And I ended up coming back after 3 years and getting into the American public education system. So that's something that's a little different about me.
Well, what else is unique is that usually people will go there just to work, and they don't necessarily have this passion for teaching and education. They're just doing it so they can live there, they can pay their bills, they can maybe sit with shuyukh. But it's like Allahu Mubarak, even coming from like a political science background, I mean, you really dove in head. I mean, you really have become Allahu Mubarak, like an expert in this field. I mean, you really have taken it very seriously, and I mean, I guess this was the beginning of it, like just jumping into it, teaching, taking it seriously, having all these kids over and tutoring them. I mean, how did you sort of, I guess, switch tracks and taking on education?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. When I first decided I was going to do a political science degree, like what I first thought was that would lead to going into law and I'd become a lawyer. But it really was not a good idea to do that. Like that's why I eventually dropped studying constitutional law and this type of stuff and just having the focus on studying the politics of the Muslim world, because it's like an oversaturated job market and this type of thing. Now, outside of that, like a political science degree isn't a really good degree to have. It doesn't get you a job that much, this type of thing. You know, I was having kids at that time. I had a family and this type of stuff. So, you know, I wasn't going to be able to do Talib Ilm like that, even though I kind of wanted to. I had to provide for a family. And, you know, I think just, you know, I knew that education was a big thing for Muslims. You know, I knew that even before going to Saudi, and how, like, the families who brought their kids to the weekend schools and stuff were worried about the kids' education there and that type of thing. You know, you had the Muslim parents in America trying to get their kids an Islamic education. Then you had this whole advent in Saudi of Muslim parents trying to get their kids an American education, all that type of stuff. It was very challenging being a teacher in Saudi, you know. I mean, it's challenging being a teacher anywhere, but, you know, it's completely untrained when I went there. Didn't get great training when I get there, although the school was really trying. And, you know, they throw you in a room with 4 concrete walls and 25 kids and say, here, go teach them. And you got to figure it out on the fly. And alhamdulillah, I'm really glad there is no video of me teaching that. I taught first grade my first year teaching in that Saudi school. I am very thankful there is no video of me teaching at that time, because people would think something else about me. It was a real struggle. But I don't know, Akhi, that became like a problem to solve. You know, I had a good brother who I was there with, the brother who helped me get the job there. Shout out to brother Omar, Chris Schumacher. Some people might know him out there. He's still in the Khalij working as a principal and this type of thing. And, you know, so, like, classroom management is a big thing we were struggling with there at the time. Like, it's hard to get those kids under control and learning all that type of stuff. So we kind of went about problem solving it. You know, I think it was just apparent, too, because actually when I was first there, I was also talking with people, like, the idea of maybe starting your own school. I don't know, it was just clear to me there was an opportunity in it. It was a problem to solve. And I don't know, anything you take on, you want to do as best you can with it. So yeah, I started digging into it. You know, I mean, I will say my family, it wasn't difficult for my family to be in Saudi, but my wife had never lived outside of Minnesota before that and this type of thing. So I went there on a 3-year contract, and she didn't want to stay any longer. So by the time I was in the middle of my second year there, I knew I'd be going back eventually. So I started doing classes for a teaching license online when I was there and this type of thing. So, you know, I just ended up getting committed into it. And, you know, in 2013 came back. I still didn't have a teaching license, but I was able to get a teaching job at a charter school in Minnesota. And, you know, that's, you know, so again, like, I don't quite know anyone else who did it, who went to the Khalij, got started teaching, and then came back to the public education system in Minnesota or in America.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's sort of try to, I guess, give an overview of that experience. I know it's been many years, but I mean, what was it like, I guess, after coming back and really focusing on this new direction, this new career path of education, and your experience up until today, I guess, in that regard?
Well, okay, I mean, I'll probably talk for a long time here, Akhi, because, like, I'm obviously really into to everything going on in education in America and this type of stuff. And I mean, you know, initially, like, when I got this job at this charter school, I mean, everyone knows about critical race theory, as they might call it, or equity and all this type of stuff, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, all this type of stuff. That's a big focus now and really has blown up across America since George Floyd was killed, gone into corporate America and all this type of stuff. All of that has been in education a really, really long time, and all of it was originally done in education. So, like, the first days I was working in education, we were doing, like, racial equity training the first couple of days. And I had never heard about that type of thing before, because you didn't find out about it through the news or social media at the time, because it was all going on in education, kind of exclusive to education before it hit the broader society and this type of thing. So, I mean, when you start a teaching job, you know, you have a week or 2 weeks before the kids get there. And at this charter school I was at, Partnership Academy Charter School in Minnesota, a very good charter school, actually. They were really deep in all this diversity and racial equity training. Now, I know a lot of people have negative associations with it. And there's certain, you know, it's like anything else that is not rooted in Islam. There's going to be things that are good and bad about it. But overall, my experience of it then was that it was a tremendous opportunity. Now, I had always wanted to teach people about Islam. And I mean, from the moment I became Muslim, and even kind of before that, the West's lack of knowledge and understanding about Islam was something that was a problem that needed to be solved. and something that we definitely needed to do something about. And, through working with kids and stuff, how that affects kids in the school system and the anxiety of parents and this type of thing, Muslim parents that they have and all that type of stuff being taught by people who know nothing about Islam. That had all been, very apparent to me. So when I was doing this diet, like seeing how interested educators in America were to learn about diversity, and they want to learn about people of different races, and they want to learn about people of different cultures, I'm like, well, this is great. This is like the perfect opportunity to start teaching people about Islam, because they're like devoting their profession to this. So, I mean, that charter school, there wasn't Muslim kids at that charter school. It was all Latino students. So I didn't have I was at that school for 3 years. I didn't have the opportunity to do that then. But I was doing my master's degree at Hamlin University at the time. And pretty much all throughout doing my studies in education, I worked on developing a program that would teach non-Muslim educators all about Islam and all about the needs of Muslim kids, the way they learn, everything you need to know to respect a Muslim kid's religion, all this type of stuff. So, I mean, that's what people kind of know me, like for those who know me, that's what they kind of know me for now to a degree. I wrote a book and created a training program for educators called Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools. And I started doing that first with Minneapolis Public Schools and then branching it out privately to really districts across the country now, beginning in the year 2016.
Yeah, I highly recommend everyone to get that book and read it. It's extremely beneficial. I mean, whether you're a public school teacher or not, I mean, there's history about the Muslim community in America. There's a lot of beneficial information about just kids, how they learn and things of that nature. And there's Dawah in there as well, which is also, like, it's very interesting, subhanAllah, how other Allah, you were just on this certain path, and I mean, Allah just led you to these different things, and
Yeah, I really want people to get the idea, and I still am doing trainings for public school educators and this type of thing. I mean, it's like a business that I have. I don't want to say I'm moving away from that, but I'm more and more doing trainings on like instruction and behavior management for Islamic private schools, because I think the direction that the community is going in, needs to go in, and where the real opportunity is to take control of education ourselves and to start our own schools and our own institutions, all this type of thing. So that's more the direction that I'm moving in now. But, the thing about this whole diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff is it's moved into like every sphere of the society now. It's moved into the corporate world. And I'll say a benefit people will get from my book, it is a book written for a non-Muslim audience to explain Islam and Muslims to them regarding a professional context. So like you said, there's dawah in it. There is dawah in it in that it educates about Islam, but it's not like written from an angle of calling someone to Islam. It's written, this is what you need to know for your professional context. And I say this because Muslims, they're kind of edgy about DEI. I mean, some Muslims are edgy about DEI because there's an end of it that gets into LGBT and gender identity and all this type of stuff. They don't want anything to do with that type of thing. There's maybe other Muslims who they just buy into what it already is and they get too into the race stuff and this type of stuff. We need to make our own space with it. It is an opportunity to teach people about Islam in an organized fashion. The thing I am proudest about the work that I did with that is being able to present formally to people about Islam over the course of 6 hours in a day. And this is something that Muslims really need to think about. Like, when do you get the opportunity to present about Islam in an extended way? And to really teach people about Islam, you have to teach it from A to Z, or you have to teach from the ground up, where things are put in its proper place. And learning continuum is very, very important for people. So, I mean, like, alhamdulillah, people are getting to know Islam better in American society, but there is still really a lot of work to be done. And, we're doing so much work on social media and this type of thing, but social media is mostly reactionary. It is mostly reactionary and defensive. Now, there's a way to enter that where you try to back people up and explain Islam, from the ground up that way, but you're already starting from a place of conflict. And even in social media, the algorithms limit our reach, and for information about Islam, the reach is limited to people who have a self-interest in Islam. So either they're people like you and I were, where we have an interest in learning about the religion for its own sake, or they are against Islam and they're learning about it because that or this type of thing. In the professional worlds, with this emphasis on diversity and learning about diversity, and the more that people are around Muslims, people are developing a professional interest in learning about Islam. That's the thing about educators. They might not have a personal interest in it. Most of them don't. But they have a professional interest in it because they're teaching kids from Muslim families. Same thing in the corporate world where people have coworkers who are Muslims. And there's all this emphasis on respecting different cultures and all that type of stuff. It's really something that we need to utilize and be proactive in this type of thing.
Yeah, I think you set an excellent example for that, and seeing an opportunity and going about it the right way, to educate the people. MashaAllah.
Jazakallah.
And you also mentioned kind of switching directions a little bit. And I think that's sort of, we definitely experienced that the past 2 days with the event that you came for, because that's really what it was focused on. It was more so locally introducing people to what's going on with Straight Path Academy, which is the Islamic school we're trying to establish. Yeah. And then you talked about how to manage kids, how kids learn. Very beneficial information for educators, for parents, for everyone, for the Muslim community. If we can all get on the same page, then it can just make such a big difference in terms of future generations being brought up with these sorts of guardians all on the same page about these things. So where did some of those ideas come from, I guess? Because it seems like you're really pioneering this in a sense. I mean, you're kind of the only Muslim that I know that really focuses on these things specifically,
Well, I mean, just if you're going to survive as an educator, you have to learn how to actually teach. You have to learn how to actually manage kids and this type of thing. So, a fair amount of my career was devoted to really learning about that. And even teaching non-Muslim educators about Muslim kids. Muslims don't always like to hear this, but there is some specific dynamics that their kids bring into a classroom, regardless of the ethnicity. Muslim kids are more likely to belong to a socially tight-knit community than the average American kid. So, a lot of times Muslim kids come into the classrooms and they already have friends. Whereas, your standard white American kid, he's going to come into the classroom, and the first day of school, he's looking to make friends. So it's actually common, and I cite even case studies going back to the 80s that show this in my book about Muslim kids. A lot of times educators struggle with how social they are in class. They can't get them to pay attention because they won't stop and listen and this type of thing because they're too busy talking to each other. Or that type of stuff. There's these different types of dynamics that I ended up having to teach non-Muslim educators about. And I had to search myself and experiment myself for what the right techniques are. Kids who talk a lot and they really want to socialize and stuff during school. How do you get them quiet in a respectful way, get them to listen, this type of stuff? And the best way to instruct them as well. And even things, too, that Muslim kids go through in school. They go through a process that academics refer to as being double-schooled, many of them in America at least, because so many of the kids, they might go to the public school Monday through Friday, but then they are in a formal or quasi-formal learning environment Saturday, Sunday, or one of the two, sometimes in the evenings on the week when they're learning to memorize the Quran, or we have them sitting in lectures or this type of thing. So they get learner habits conditioned into both places. What is best for a kid is that there is consistency and coordination between the learning styles in both places. If there isn't, that's a whole difficult thing for a kid to navigate. So you have these public school educators who are trying to teach these kids, and the kids have learner habits formed in another place. It makes sense for them to know what those are and what those learning styles are like so that they can draw upon them as a resource as opposed to clashing against them. So a whole part of my program is teaching non-Muslim educators of what learning in masajid is like, so that they can understand the type of style it is and and you have to, use a pedagogical lens yourself as an educator to ascertain the type of learner habits that it inculcates in kids and this type of thing. So, just those things got me very interested in instruction and in behavior management in general. Now, it turns out people have a hard time believing this when I tell them, but American education has used flawed theories and methodologies for a very, very long time. They've essentially gone in and out of fashion in cycles over the past 100 years since the progressive pedagogy movement happened in America, beginning with John Dewey, who most people have heard of, or they know about the Dewey Decimal System or this type of thing. The past 30 years in American education has had a lot of these flawed methodologies. It's at the root of what has caused what they call the achievement gap in American schools, where there is a great disparity between white kids and students of color. And, and especially between kids whose parents have a high education level themselves, and they have the time and the resources to make up the education that is not being done in the public schools. Because the schools using progressive teaching methodologies, I'm not talking about social politics or anything like that going on in schools. This is actually a bigger problem with the schools. They have been using teaching methods based on progressive educational theory, which is what they will call child-centered learning or this type of thing, which the most objective research that exists shows pretty undeniably that it doesn't work to actually teach kids. So there's been a whole lot of non-learning going on in American schools, and the only kids who have been successful in this learning context is kids whose parents can make it up at home, either by teaching them themselves or hiring them tutors and this type of thing. So, I mean, that whole thing just got me really into education and behavior management in general. So, when I first got on social media in like 2021, I was doing this work. I do trainings through educators and consultancy just by direct reach out. I didn't use social media as a marketing tool at all. But another brother really encouraged me to do it a few years ago. And my whole thinking was I'm going to draw Muslim parents to me on social media by giving them the benefit of all the things I've learned about kids and teaching and managing kids and all this type of stuff. So that's what my presence on social media has largely focused on, this type of thing. And, so from there, I've been connecting with Islamic schools and masajid and all this type of stuff to get these skills to Muslim parents, teachers, and educators, and really everyone. Because it's difficult parenting for Muslims, especially immigrants, because when you come here, it's a totally different context, not just in the culture being different, but, not having the homogeneity in the adult world that you might have had back home. So, back home, you have everyone on the same page as far as the values they want to give kids. And that kind of makes it easier in a way to keep kids in line in a certain way. But here you can't have that. And then, that stresses parents out. And if you get too stressed at kids, you end up creating downward spirals and this type of thing. So there's really this question facing Muslim parents and Muslim adults of how you reach kids and how you keep them within certain boundaries. Because that's a whole part of failed educational theory in the West and failed parenting theory. It's all rooted on just letting the child find themselves in this type of thing. There's a degree to which you want to let kids become themselves. But Islamically, and also just what's better for them in life, you want to keep them within healthy boundaries, and we certainly want that as Muslims. So how do you keep them within those boundaries when you don't have the society on your side, and when you don't have the type of coercive methods that you might have had back home in this type of thing? You have to develop a relationship with them. You have to get them to respect you and to believe in you and the wisdom that you bring them in this type of thing.
So for those who are interested, I guess, more so in seeing you in action, teaching some of these skills, inshallah, we're going to be posting the event, 2-day event, inshallah. Also, Institute Academy, we're going to have a course where you're basically teaching these same things, and they're extremely beneficial. I mean, I hope that you just do more in terms of publishing books and things of that nature. But I mean, if people are interested, what sort of resources are there for them aside from what I just mentioned, I guess?
Well, they can go to my channel, which is Abraham Education on YouTube, Abraham_Education on Instagram, and just follow me there because I do live streams, do Q&As, do videos on different topics, this type of thing. I also have a full parenting course for Muslims called Parenting Skills Muslims Need. It's like 12 hours and all these types of skills that I'm talking about and how to get kids to be on the path that we want them to without it being like a whole stressful struggle. And there's a lot of soft skills when it comes to teaching and parenting that have a lot of really subtle detail to them, and that I've learned in teaching over time. So I've made all those teaching all those available to Muslim parents, and go to muslimparentskills.com, or they can just go to my website abrahameducation.com, and on the front page I have a link to the course and this type of stuff. They can get that. Anyone can reach out to me anytime, info@abrahameducation.com. You want me to do training for your school, for your masjid. I really like training. The people working in the weekend schools and this type of stuff, may Allah bless them, because they're working very, very hard. There's minimal support for them some of the time. The kids, when they go there on the weekends, they don't always want to be there. because they don't, just like we didn't like going to Sunday school.
Yeah, it's their weekend, right?
Right, so. Exactly. So like you really need good skills. So I really enjoy teaching masjid teachers this type of stuff. And I'm doing, if you follow me on social media, I offer trainings regularly on how to manage kids, this type of stuff that you can sign up for and this type of thing.
Yeah, one thing that I think everyone loved about the presentations that you gave is you would talk about certain skills. You'd go into detail about how kids perceive things, and you say, okay, so that being the case, you should deal with them this way, and then you would show actual like real life examples like in the classroom, and you'd show how it works, and you'd show how much goes into it that you wouldn't even, normally you wouldn't even think about it. You'd just be reacting, but you very conscientiously are seeing things happening, you're responding, knowing how they're going to react to what you're doing. And it's incredible because, even there were young people there that were watching that were like fascinated by what you were saying, so it's extremely beneficial. And if like the goal really is if we can have like these Islamic schools where everyone is on the same page, you train the teachers, and then also that can trickle down to the parents as well. And then everyone's on the same page. That's how you can really bring up, a proper generation of kids.
And this gets into something, there's actually a really big opportunity for the Muslim community right now in education. Yeah. American education is an absolute mess. Okay, putting all the stuff that we get concerned about in the Muslim community with the LGBT stuff and the stuff in the news, put that aside. It's a mess aside from all that type of stuff. It's completely lost. So if we develop our own educational institutions, there's really a chance to use what is actually best practice in education. Now, to give people an idea of some of the things you're talking about, when it comes to managing kids, teaching them from the classroom, getting them to listen to you and all this type of thing, you need specified techniques in nonverbal communication to really do that well. It's a huge focus of what my course teaches in my trainings. So what you do with your body language, your facial expression, your tone of voice, all these type of stuff. There are all kinds of subtleties to that and things that work that kids are responsive to, and understanding how kids interpret certain things. Kids are very, very sensitive to that. Kids are very imaginative. So a lot of times they project attitudes and ideas onto adults that adults don't always mean to portray, especially when adults get stressed out, and kids stress adults out and they annoy them and they trigger them. So like a base problem that people have is when they're trying to manage or teach kids, they do it operating on stress reactions. And if you don't control yourself with that, you create a downward spiral with the kid. Now, in education, this stuff, even in the field of education, you have to actually dig to learn about this stuff. It's not what schools commonly do. And schools, Muslims, they tend to have this perception that like, okay, we are like old-fashioned, or we are backwards and we like just yell and hit our kids or this type of thing. So we don't know what we're doing. And, every culture has gone through that. The West used to do that worse than the Muslim world. And you do not want that to be the base of how you treat kids or this type of thing. But what you can't do is go to the opposite end of the spectrum, which this is what the West has done, of thinking that, okay, if you don't want to be mean to the kids, how else do you control them? Well, what people calculate is, well, then we'll just be nice to them. And we'll just reward them for doing positive things and this type of thing. And this is what's most commonly done in the American schools. So kids, they might not be being threatened with being hit or anything like that. Sometimes they're threatened with like suspensions or that type of thing, but it's actually getting rarer for all kinds of reasons. But what they are is they're incentivized with external rewards like points, candy, free time at the end of class, all this type of stuff. And sometimes Muslim parents do that as well when they don't want to like yell at the kids. They don't want to hit them or this type of thing. They don't know what else to do. But that over time has a negative effect on the kids. And it has an effect that isn't that much different than just yelling at them or hitting them. Because both things condition the kids to only respond to external stimuli. So they only do things for the sake of some external threat or some external reward. And they don't actually develop an internal and an emotionally grounded appreciation for doing what you want them to do. And kids don't learn that way very well, too. It's a huge problem in education right now. Kids, you ask any teacher, they are so obsessed about the grade, and they have been conditioned to thinking that school is just a point system. And they just calculate what the minimum amount of work they need to do to get the grade that their parents want them to get. And they do that and move on in school. And, especially teaching high school now. I first taught elementary school, and I teach high school. It is such a problem in high school, the kids arriving not knowing anything. Like literally having zero background knowledge that they're supposed to come to the high school classes prepared with. And when you dig into it, it's because they didn't actually absorb anything, because they weren't actually motivated to do the learning. They're just motivated to get the points. And this creates narcissistic people, and it creates people who are prone to addiction. And then you have all the device stuff that's feeding the same kind of nurturing of the kids. So it's a whole damaging thing of society. But there is a way. There is a way to keep kids under control and to motivate them and to get them to buy into the adult as an authority figure who they respect and whose authority and wisdom they will submit to and buy into. So if Islamic schools can learn this methodology and they can learn the teaching methodologies that actually get kids to memorize information and know information, which they actually have more grounding in their tradition than they realize. The Islamic institutions actually do have the potential over the course of a generation to become the best learning institutions in America if they go the right way.
Yeah, and that definitely it leads into what I wanted to tell people to do is if you're really interested in understanding more of what you're talking about is to listen to your khutbah, because another thing that you do is, not only do you come with all this valuable information that's been tested and proven by yourself in the classroom, but it's linked to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's linked to the Quran, and so it's linked to Islam, which is so important. That's really, really crucial. And I loved how you did that in the khutbah.
Someone will say on that, Akhi, because alhamdulillah, all praise is due to Allah. And for Muslim professionals out there, and especially the young people, sometimes I've seen young people go through things where some of the cultural aspects of their families annoy them. You can go through that as the child of an immigrant in America. Okay, take the discussion for mental health an example, okay? Like, you certainly see it, a lot of kids, they grow up, they have these emotional issues, this type of thing, which gets identified to them now as mental health issues. And they interpret their parents' culture, which was, if they came from a Muslim culture, it was a more collectivist culture than American culture, which is more individualized. And more collectivist cultures, they don't have as individualized a concept of mental health like we do in the modern day West. So you'll find these kids of Muslim parents, Muslim immigrant parents saying like, our parents are they're ignorant, they don't think mental health is real, all this type of stuff. And then they'll go take a psychology course in university and they'll think like that's the answer to it. Now, in the Western sciences and in the Western fields, you can find effective things and things that are beneficial. But whatever you are looking at, you have to filter it through Islam. And you have to ask yourself, what correlates to the principles that Islam teaches? And when you do that, that is actually how you will find the stuff that works. It won't be the things that prevail as predominant in these fields. But in all these fields, there's big discourses, and the people who want young people to develop self-discipline. They want people to have a sense of accountability. That's what I was looking for when I was looking into instruction and behavior management in the field of education. The courses you take, they teach all this, just let the child find themselves type of stuff. I want to know who was putting as their principles, we want the kids to behave well. We want the kids to have a sense of accountability. We want the kids to mature, that type of thing. Because I knew that's what Islam taught. So especially to the young Muslim professionals out there, you have to have that type of lens. So, what you say about the khutbah and linking it to Islam, when that's done, that's what will actually help us excel in different fields in this type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what we have to do in Islamic education always. It's like there's nothing truly, ultimately secular in that way, right? And that's something that I noticed studying in Medina, because in Kulliyat al-Da'wah, we studied psychology, we studied teaching and education, and it's like you would think, these are just secular, but they were all grounded in Quran and Sunnah. Even if it's just, somewhat basic hadith and ayat here and there, but it means so much because that has to be the lens. It always has to be the lens. So inshallah, with our Islamic institutions, that could go such a long way, because if people don't have that grounding, they go astray. They really will go astray, because then they think that, the ultimate truth comes from something else,
Absolutely. And we see it happening.
Jazakallah khair. So beneficial. Michael Abraham, it was such a pleasure, getting to know you and hang out with you and spend time with you and benefit from, your presentations and also this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me so much.
Oh, man, it was a pleasure. Inshallah, hopefully we can, maybe I'll go to Minnesota sometime, but definitely want to bring you back to Florida, inshallah. But yeah, let's send the people your way in terms of social media where they can follow your projects, Abraham Education. I'll give you the last word, inshallah.
So Abraham Education on YouTube. I think you just search Abraham Education. You'll find AbrahamEducation.com. If you know public school educators, your kid goes to public school, refer their teachers to there. That's where they can get my training, engaging Muslim students in public schools, or contact me through that website or at info@abrahameducation.com to book for trainings. And Masajid and Islamic private schools I can do trainings for as well. Go to MuslimParentSkills.com to get my parenting course. Instagram, Abraham_education, and Abraham Education on TikTok, and Abraham EDUC on X.
jazakumAllahukhairan. Make sure that you follow, you subscribe, all those things. We'll check the links in the description, inshallah. And until next time, jazakumAllahukhairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.